Today's story dives into three chilling cases of unsolved serial killings that have haunted investigators for decades. First, the discovery of multiple victims along Long Island's Gilgo beach unravels the mystery of a suspected serial killer whose identity remains a terrifying enigma. Then, we travel to the desolate Texas killing fields, where decades of disappearances and murders create a graveyard of unanswered questions. Finally, we explore the new Bedford Highway Killer case, a series of disappearances and murders that have left a Massachusetts community searching for justice. But before we begin, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right place. We upload daily, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an upload. Alright, let's get into today's story. On the evening of April 30th, 2010, a coastal fog rolled over the quiet, secluded neighborhood of Oak Beach, New York. This small community, situated along the south shore of Long Island, typically saw little more than a whisper of life after dark. But that night, as midnight approached, the silence in Oak Beach was broken by the erratic footsteps and panicked breaths of a young woman. This was Shannon Gilbert, 24 years old, running through the shadows, her face pale and frantic as she knocked on doors in search of help. Shannon was a young woman with aspirations beyond her life's circumstances. She'd left her home in Jersey City earlier that evening for a pre-arranged meeting, a type of appointment she'd become familiar with over the past year. She had dreams, of course, hopes of a singing career, of finding stability, of breaking free from the cycles that had entrapped her. Yet here she was, far from the safety she sought, her night taking a turn that neither she nor anyone around her could have predicted. Her journey to Oak Beach had been arranged by her client, an escort agency, facilitated by a man named Michael Pack. Pack had driven her out to meet her client, a local Oak Beach resident named Joseph Brewer. What was supposed to be a straightforward arrangement quickly spiraled into something unnerving. The exact details of what triggered Shannon's sudden fear are still a mystery. What is clear is that something inside that house had terrified her enough to send her fleeing into the night. At 4:51 a.m., Shannon dialed 911 from her cell phone, a call that would last over 22 minutes, a plea that seemed to echo into the void. Her voice, trembling and afraid, pleaded with the dispatcher, "They're trying to kill me." Her words, both desperate and confused, seemed to waver between fear and disorientation. Her call became her lifeline, even as the dispatcher tried to pinpoint her location on the dark, winding streets of Oak Beach. Yet despite her pleas, she could not bring herself to say exactly who was after her. She just kept saying someone was coming, that she was afraid, and that she needed help. Meanwhile, as Shannon stumbled through the unfamiliar neighborhood, two of Oak Beach's residents, a man and a woman, each with their own reasons for being awake at that hour, saw her near their homes. They reported seeing her frantic, confused, knocking on their doors and calling for help. But when they attempted to help her, she ran further into the night, as if entrapped in an invisible maze. Every light she saw might have been salvation, but every shadow seemed to carry the threat she could not define. The community of Oak Beach, typically hidden in the stillness of the night, was slowly waking up, aware that something was terribly wrong. The woman who had encountered Shannon later told police of the unusual sight. Shannon in the early morning, a figure shrouded in fear, running from something unseen. Even more troubling, Shannon had shed her shoes, leaving them abandoned along her path, as if they had only slowed her down. As dawn began to edge over the horizon, Shannon's phone went silent. The dispatcher, who had stayed on the line with her for as long as possible, had been unable to locate her exact position. The long minutes on that call echoed with tension, yet now, only silence remained. The Suffolk County Police Department dispatched officers to Oak Beach later that morning, initiating a preliminary search in the area where Shannon had last been seen. But when they arrived, the dense marshes and tangled vegetation along the coastline concealed any trace of her. Days turned to weeks, and Shannon's family, desperate for answers, continued pressing law enforcement to intensify the search. They held vigils, appealed to the media, and hired a private investigator in hopes of finding any clue that could explain her disappearance. But Shannon was gone, her last steps buried under the weight of sand and silence. Then, in December 2010, 7 months after Shannon had vanished, a Suffolk County police officer and his trained canine were conducting a routine search along Ocean Parkway, just a few miles from Oak Beach. They had been searching for signs of Shannon when they stumbled upon something that cast a darker, more chilling light over her disappearance. Instead of finding Shannon, they uncovered a set of human remains, skeletal and wrapped carefully in burlap. The grisly discovery led police to immediately widen their search, combing the windswept dunes and marshy undergrowth along Ocean Parkway. Over the following days, the skeletal remains of 3 additional victims were unearthed, all similarly wrapped, all concealed along the same desolate stretch of land. These victims were soon identified as women, each having lived a life that brought them in proximity to Shannon's world. Like her, they had disappeared without a trace, their fates seemingly interwoven with the same shadowy threads. In the quiet, windswept sand dunes of Long Island, the police had unwittingly stumbled upon the remnants of a nightmare that had been carefully hidden, piece by piece, along the lonely coast. Each body uncovered in the marshes cast doubt on the theory that Shannon's disappearance was just a tragic accident or random misfortune. Instead, it began to appear that she might have been ensnared by something far more sinister. The remains found along Ocean Parkway pointed to a calculated and deliberate killer, someone with both knowledge of the terrain and a frightening disregard for human life. But despite these grim discoveries, Shannon was still missing. The landscape, bleak and vast, seemed to swallow all who ventured too far into its depths. The Suffolk County Police intensified their investigation, now fully convinced they were dealing with a serial predator whose reach had spanned years, if not decades. The family of Shannon Gilbert remained steadfast, unwilling to let her name slip away, like so many others lost to the shadows. They continued to search, hopeful that each day might bring them closer to understanding what had happened that cold spring morning. For the residents of Oak Beach and the surrounding communities, the quietude of their coastal haven was forever shattered. And yet, despite the eerie discoveries, the question still lingered. Was Shannon one of the killer's victims? Or had her fear that night been rooted in something else? The discovery of 4 bodies along Ocean Parkway was the beginning of a search that would unearth layers of dark, chilling secrets buried in the sands of Long Island. As detectives expanded their search area, they quickly realized that they might be facing one of the most complex and horrifying cases the county had ever seen. The initial discovery shocked the Suffolk County Police Department and quickly drew the attention of the media, amplifying the public's concern about a possible serial predator hiding in plain sight. The police named this case the Long Island Serial Killer Investigation, though the full scale of what they were dealing with was still unclear. For days, officers combed through the brush, carefully sifting through the earth and thick coastal vegetation in hopes of uncovering anything that might provide clues to the identity of the person responsible. Yet, as they scoured the area, the marshlands seemed to yield only more tragedy. By early spring of 2011, they had discovered additional remains, bringing the total count to 10. The newly uncovered bodies told a story as haunting as the winds that swept across the dunes. Many of the victims, like the first 4, were found wrapped in burlap, a rough material often used to carry heavy loads, which seemed to imply a calculated and methodical killer. These clues pointed to someone who understood the art of concealment, someone who knew that burlap would eventually blend with the natural environment, reducing the likelihood of a random discovery. Each detail that surfaced painted a portrait of a person who was both careful and disturbingly organized. The victims were identified as women, most of whom were last seen alive, while working in a profession that placed them in a vulnerable and often overlooked part of society. Their similarities were undeniable, each profile an echo of the others, a chilling consistency that led investigators to conclude they had likely been targeted for this very reason. While detectives couldn't establish a direct connection between Shannon and the other victims, the similarities between their lives cast an ominous shadow over her disappearance. It seemed more likely than ever that she, too, had fallen prey to this elusive predator. Among the victims was a woman named Maureen Brainard Barnes, who had vanished in 2007. A 25-year-old from Connecticut, Maureen had come to New York for work and disappeared without a trace. Her family had searched relentlessly, hoping against hope, but Maureen's trail had gone cold, her life slipping quietly into the shadows. Another victim, Melissa Barthélemy, 24, had also been working in the city when she disappeared in 2009. Her family later recalled receiving a series of disturbing phone calls from an unknown number, taunting them with vile, harassing messages that hinted at her fate but offered no clues about her location. The list of victims grew as investigators unearthed more remains, including Megan Waterman, a young mother of two who vanished in June 2010, and Amber Lynn Costello, 27, who had disappeared that September. Each of these women had been seeking a way to survive in a city that offered little sympathy for those on the margins, their lives touched by struggles that often went unnoticed by the world around them. They had faced the dangers that came with their profession, yet no one could have anticipated the unimaginable horror awaiting them. Law enforcement faced pressure from the families of the victims, from the media, and from the public, all demanding answers. Each discovery added weight to an already intense investigation. Detectives were scrutinizing every piece of evidence, combing through the victims' personal connections, phone records, and last known movements. They were building a profile, and as they did, they grew increasingly certain that this was the work of one individual, someone who had preyed upon these women with a terrifying precision and patience. As the investigation intensified, detectives began to consider that this individual might live nearby, or at least be someone intimately familiar with the landscape of Long Island's South Shore. The decision to use burlap, the way the bodies were spaced along the remote parkway, all pointed to someone who was comfortable navigating these isolated areas without fear of detection. This was someone who knew the marshes, someone who could move through them with a predator's instinct. With each new piece of evidence, however, there were setbacks. Leads would emerge only to end in dead ends, potential suspects dismissed after rigorous questioning, and the sheer scale of the investigation overwhelmed even the most experienced officers. And although tips poured in, most of them led nowhere. The frustrating search for answers took its toll on both the police force and the families involved, as they clung to the hope that some break in the case would bring justice for their loved ones. The case received renewed focus in the spring of 2011, when Shannon's mother, Mari Gilbert, began a public campaign demanding justice for her daughter and the other victims. She fought to keep Shannon's name and face in the news, her determination a testament to a mother's relentless love and pursuit of the truth. Marie insisted that Shannon's disappearance was no accident, that her daughter's desperate 911 call had been a cry for help that went unanswered. But Mary's battle was far from easy. She faced resistance from law enforcement and skepticism from the public, who often questioned whether Shannon's case was connected to the other women. Yet, Marie's resolve was unshakable. She believed in her daughter, in the fear she heard in that final phone call, and she was determined to prove that Shannon had been another victim of the Long Island serial killer. By mid-2011, police had identified multiple persons of interest, each with potential connections to the victims and to the secluded Oak Beach neighborhood. However, these leads never yielded enough evidence for an arrest. Frustration mounted as each day passed without a clear resolution. Detectives struggled with the sense that the answer was within reach, yet obscured by an invisible barrier that kept them from fully understanding the horror they were dealing with. As summer turned to fall, the marshes grew denser, concealing the secrets they held even more tightly. The community in Oak Beach became divided, some terrified by the possibility of a killer among them, others frustrated by the intense scrutiny and media attention that had shattered the quiet of their once hidden enclave. Even as search parties dwindled, the ominous landscape of Long Island's coast seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for someone to finally uncover the full truth. The investigation had consumed everyone involved, especially those who had seen the pain and loss inflicted on the victims' families. For Shannon's family, and the loved ones of the other women, the case had become a haunting journey, one that had taken them from hope to despair, only to leave them suspended in uncertainty. Yet, as the year drew to a close, law enforcement remained vigilant, determined that the shadows of Long Island would not swallow these women's stories entirely. The coast and its secrets lay silent under the winter sky, but for those who sought answers, each day carried the weight of knowing that somewhere, perhaps close by, a person with unimaginable darkness still walked free. By the beginning of 2012, the search for the Long Island serial killer had transformed into one of the most intense investigations on the East Coast. The case, fueled by media coverage and public fear, had unearthed a web of troubling patterns, each detail hinting at a calculated presence moving through the shadows of Long Island's South Shore. Detectives, working under intense scrutiny, faced an adversary who left little evidence, a figure whose methods spoke to years of evasion, planning, and possibly even a history of similar crimes. Forensic experts were brought in to piece together clues from the remains, hoping for a breakthrough that would bring the investigation closer to an answer. Each discovery only deepened the mystery. Among the unsettling findings was the killer's seeming preference for burlap, a coarse material used in landscaping, known for blending with the natural elements of the coastline. This pointed to someone who likely had access to the material and, more disturbingly, an understanding of how it would aid in hiding his tracks. Detectives and criminal profilers speculated that this choice was no coincidence. This was someone who knew how to cover his trail, suggesting either experience or a background in work that required such materials. One of the largest challenges for investigators was the absence of personal ties among the victims. They had no known connections to each other, beyond shared work that made them vulnerable. This added to the profile emerging around the killer, an individual who specifically targeted people on the fringes of society, people who might not immediately be missed, or whose lives might be scrutinized less carefully. It became clear that this was no ordinary predator, but rather someone who planned each encounter with chilling precision. As detectives reviewed the mounting evidence, they began to piece together a psychological profile of the individual they were hunting. The behavior suggested someone organized, a person who sought to control every aspect of the crime, including the final moments of his victims. The choice of location was telling as well. The killer was clearly comfortable with the desolate stretches of coastline, able to navigate its thick brush and hidden paths with confidence. Whoever this person was, he had managed to evade capture, suggesting he was either very lucky or very careful. And with each new piece of evidence, detectives grew more convinced that he had likely killed before. Meanwhile, Marie Gilbert continued to fight for answers about her daughter Shannon's case, pushing for it to be officially classified as a homicide rather than an accident. She argued that Shannon's final hours and her frantic 911 call pointed to foul play, not an accidental death or simple misfortune. Murray's pleas resonated with the public, who had grown increasingly skeptical of the initial police conclusions. The possibility that Shannon's disappearance and the other murders were connected now seemed undeniable to many, adding a layer of urgency to Murray's campaign. Despite the push from Murray and the public, however, the investigation continued to stall. The thick marshes along Ocean Parkway, with their dense underbrush and complex terrain, provided the perfect cover for anyone seeking to disappear from sight. Searches for additional evidence were hampered by the natural landscape, a barrier that seemed to guard the secrets hidden there. The frustration among detectives and the families grew as each search ended without further answers. The investigative team, working in coordination with the FBI, began focusing on Oak Beach residents who might have had the access and means to commit these crimes undetected. There were many leads but few breakthroughs, and with each interview, the detectives' profiles of potential suspects grew longer. Some residents expressed deep concerns, hinting that there were locals with both the resources and familiarity with the area to elude capture. Rumors circulated about certain people who seemed to fit the profile, including local figures whose behavior or associations raised eyebrows. Yet, even as suspicions grew, concrete evidence remained elusive. As the search continued, detectives were forced to consider that the killer might be someone who understood the legal system, possibly even someone with connections to law enforcement or knowledge of investigation techniques. This theory cast a dark shadow over the search, adding to the paranoia surrounding the case. If the killer was indeed someone with inside knowledge, it would explain the baffling lack of physical evidence, as well as the precision with which the crimes had been committed. Adding another layer of complication, a former Oak Beach resident, Dr. Peter Hackett, emerged as a figure of interest in Shannon's case. Hackett was a physician who had lived near the site of her disappearance, and some residents recalled him as someone who often inserted himself into the lives of others. Shannon's mother, Marie, recalled that Hackett had allegedly called her after Shannon disappeared, claiming he had offered her daughter help on the night she vanished. Hackett later denied any involvement, and the nature of his interactions with Shannon remained ambiguous. Although his connection to her case was never proven, the rumors surrounding him fueled speculation and added to the growing mystery. By the end of 2012, the case had gained international attention. True crime enthusiasts, independent investigators, and even members of the community began digging into Oak Beach's history, searching for any clue that might reveal the killer's identity. Online forums were flooded with theories, some pointing to possible suspects, while others speculated about a larger network involved in covering up the crimes. law enforcement faced increasing pressure to provide answers as the public's frustration grew. For the families of the victims, each day that passed without justice was a painful reminder of the loved ones they had lost. Many felt that the system had failed their daughters, leaving them vulnerable to a predator who seemed untouchable. Community leaders organized vigils, and advocacy groups joined the fight, urging police to keep the investigation active. The sense of fear in the community grew, with some fearing that the killer was still among them, hiding in plain sight, waiting to strike again. As the year drew to a close, it became evident that the Long Island serial killer case was far from a straightforward investigation. Each new discovery raised more questions than answers, revealing a darkness that seemed to stretch beyond Long Island, touching on the fears and insecurities of countless communities across the country. Detectives knew they were up against someone who had likely spent years refining his methods, someone who understood how to evade capture with a terrifying expertise. In the eyes of the law, the case was still open, but for the families, it felt like a door that might never close. As the years went on, the weight of unanswered questions surrounding Shannon Gilbert and the other victims pressed heavily on those left behind. For Marie Gilbert, Shannon's mother, the lack of resolution was unbearable. Despite the limited progress, Marie remained unwavering in her belief that her daughter had been a victim of foul play. She continued her public campaign, meeting with officials and raising awareness whenever possible. Marie's persistence brought renewed focus to the case, igniting debates and challenging law enforcement's original theories about Shannon's disappearance. The growing tension in the public sphere eventually compelled the Suffolk County Police Department to re-examine Shannon's case. Officials who had once dismissed her death as accidental began to look more closely at the circumstances of her disappearance and the evidence surrounding it. The reinvestigation introduced the possibility that Shannon might have encountered someone dangerous the night she vanished, someone who understood the isolation of Oak Beach well enough to feel protected by it. With Mary's encouragement, authorities agreed to commission an independent autopsy of Shannon's remains, hoping it would yield new insights. The findings were starkly different from those of the initial investigation. Where some had attributed her death to accidental causes, the new autopsy suggested signs consistent with the possibility of foul play. However, the lack of conclusive physical evidence meant that the findings could not definitively determine what had happened to her that night. Marie and her family took these findings as validation of what they had always believed, that Shannon had not disappeared by accident, but had met with circumstances beyond her control. Meanwhile, the families of the other victims joined forces, forming a support network that advocated for the investigation's continuation. Together, they reached out to journalists, activists, and even lawmakers, making their voices heard across various platforms. They called for new investigative tactics, including the use of advanced DNA testing and digital forensics, techniques that had made strides in the years since the case began. Their collective pressure encouraged law enforcement to revisit old evidence and seek innovative solutions, including partnerships with private labs and experts who specialized in forensic profiling. Despite these renewed efforts, however, substantial progress remained elusive. Investigators remained unable to link any specific suspects to the crimes. Each promising lead either fell short or left them entangled in a web of more questions. Among the most frustrating aspects was the challenge of reconstructing the victims' final moments. The limited physical evidence, the passage of time, and the complex terrain made piecing together a coherent narrative nearly impossible. The investigation often felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, a picture that could never be fully completed. In the years since the initial discoveries along Ocean Parkway, advancements in forensic technology had allowed law enforcement to uncover new types of evidence, but many pieces still could not be conclusively tied to a suspect. Detectives re-examined cell phone records, geographic data, and the victim's last known interactions, hoping to find any overlooked connection. The killer's use of burner phones, untraceable, disposable devices, only added to the difficulty, painting a picture of someone who understood how to cover their tracks with a frightening level of sophistication. Throughout these developments, the community of Oak Beach continued to live in a state of quiet unease. While some locals went about their lives as if nothing had changed, others found themselves looking over their shoulders, haunted by the possibility that the person responsible for these tragedies could still be among them. The media attention and investigation had transformed their quiet neighborhood into a place of scrutiny and suspicion. Old friendships fractured, and neighbors began to regard each other with a mix of caution and distrust. In an effort to gain fresh perspectives, detectives consulted with behavioral analysts and forensic psychologists who attempted to profile the individual responsible for these crimes. These experts described a meticulous, organized personality, someone likely leading an unassuming life, blending into society without drawing attention. The profile suggested a person with a structured existence, perhaps with a stable job or family, someone who understood the intricacies of law enforcement or investigative procedures. This unsettling characterization only intensified fears, as it painted a portrait of someone who might appear ordinary on the outside, while harboring a darkness hidden from public view. As detectives sifted through potential suspects, one name continued to resurface: Dr. Peter Hackett. His connection to Shannon's case, coupled with his proximity to the site of her disappearance, had already raised suspicion. And while no concrete evidence linked him to any of the crimes, his behavior remained a subject of intrigue. Many of those close to Shannon's family and the investigation felt that Hackett's interactions with Shannon had yet to be fully explained. However, without solid proof, Hackett could not be formally implicated, leaving only a cloud of speculation around him. For Marie, the strain of her fight for answers took its toll, yet she pressed forward, propelled by a love that refused to let Shannon's memory fade. Marie's tenacity served as both an inspiration and a painful reminder of the cost of justice. As the years passed, she became a symbol of resilience, her voice unwavering in the face of doubt. Her efforts brought renewed energy to the families of the other victims, strengthening their commitment to uncovering the truth, even as the odds seemed stacked against them. In early 2013, as the investigation continued, the case reached a pivotal point. Detectives encountered a new tool in their search: geographic profiling. This technique, often used to track patterns in serial crimes, was introduced to help narrow down potential locations associated with the killer. The profiling sought to identify a base of operations, an area where the suspect might live, work, or spend significant time. By mapping out the locations of each body discovered along the parkway, investigators hoped to zero in on the locations the killer frequented, aiming to shrink the pool of potential suspects. The geographic profile provided detectives with an intriguing pattern. The clustering of the remains suggested the killer might be operating within a limited area, possibly residing within a close radius of the marshlands. The evidence hinted at a familiarity with the landscape that allowed the killer to move undetected, a knowledge of both the terrain and the best locations to leave his victims hidden from view. While geographic profiling offered hope, it also underscored the killer's evasive nature. The individual responsible had managed to blend into the community, making use of the environment as both a staging ground and a protective barrier. For those who sought justice, the revelation brought a mix of relief and frustration. They were closer to understanding the killer's methods, but still faced the monumental task of identifying the person behind these calculated actions. As winter faded, the marshlands remained quiet, concealing secrets that the investigators continued to chase. And for those watching and waiting, the prospect of justice felt as distant as ever, hidden somewhere within the shadows of Long Island's coast. By the start of 2014, the Long Island serial killer case had become one of the most unsettling and unsolved mysteries in recent memory. Law enforcement and families alike were still grasping at clues, determined to find justice amid the haunting landscape of Ocean Parkway. The investigation had seen breakthroughs and setbacks, shifting public attention from hope to despair with each new development. Yet, for the families of Shannon Gilbert and the other victims, there was no giving up. Marie Gilbert's advocacy had brought national awareness to the case, making Shannon's story a symbol of resilience and the enduring search for truth. Marie continued to push for transparency and accountability, her fight serving as a beacon for others who feared that their loved ones' stories would remain unheard. As the search for answers pressed on, Marie's tireless pursuit of justice became the heart of a case that had often seemed to lose its way. In 2015, a small breakthrough offered new hope. Detectives had revisited old evidence from the victims' cell phones and social media accounts, hoping for new leads. Advances in digital forensics allowed them to recover previously inaccessible data, leading to the discovery of texts, location data, and communications that had not been examined in detail before. The analysis of this data yielded some promising connections among the victims, revealing that many of them had frequented similar locations and communicated with contacts in the same geographic regions. This pointed to a network, possibly of people who knew each other or who had unknowingly crossed paths in their final days. The forensic analysis was slow, methodical, and challenging, yet it brought forth valuable information. Among the findings was evidence that at least 2 of the victims had used a car service that matched descriptions provided by Oak Beach residents. These discoveries hinted at a potential link between the killer and this network, though investigators still had no concrete suspect. Law enforcement took these clues seriously, re-examining the Oak Beach community for anyone who might have known the victims or had access to the same places. The pressure to solve the case only grew as new advocacy groups emerged, rallying alongside the victims' families. These groups drew attention to the case and held public demonstrations, calling on officials to increase funding and resources for the investigation. The heightened attention added urgency, pushing the Suffolk County Police to follow every lead, no matter how tenuous. In the meantime, the FBI had become more involved in the case, providing resources and advanced investigative techniques. Specialists in geographic profiling, digital forensics, and behavioral analysis worked with local detectives to narrow down the list of potential suspects. The geographic profile generated by the FBI suggested that the killer likely lived or worked near the locations where the bodies had been found, possibly in an area close to the parkway. The profile pointed to someone familiar with the landscape, someone who had spent years learning how to use its remote terrain as a hiding place. However, despite their efforts, the FBI and Suffolk County Police found themselves in a challenging position. They had amassed a wealth of data and circumstantial evidence, yet the elusive nature of the killer left them without a clear path forward. The families continued to press for updates, hoping that the growing involvement of federal authorities would yield answers. But as time wore on, they faced the heartbreaking reality that the killer might remain unidentified. The persistence of Shannon's family, especially Mari, eventually prompted a legislative response. Lawmakers introduced reforms aimed at improving the ways police handle missing persons cases and cold cases involving vulnerable populations. These changes included mandates for more thorough investigations, new training for officers on handling cases involving high-risk individuals, and increased resources for cold case investigation. Though these efforts were welcomed, they could not undo the grief and loss experienced by the families, who had waited years for justice that seemed ever out of reach. Then, in a surprising turn, an anonymous tip led detectives to a possible lead involving a person with connections to Oak Beach. The tipster described a man who had reportedly exhibited strange behavior around the time of Shannon's disappearance. This man was known to frequent areas near Ocean Parkway and had been seen speaking with several women in similar professions as the victims. Investigators were cautious, knowing that unverified tips could lead them astray, but they nonetheless pursued this lead, examining the individual's background and possible connections to the area. As detectives delved into this person's history, they discovered details that aligned with some aspects of the criminal profile they had built. However, without direct evidence, the investigation reached another standstill, unable to make the leap from suspicion to proof. Frustrated but undeterred, law enforcement continued to monitor this individual, knowing that even the smallest misstep might reveal more than the killer intended to hide. As the investigation grew colder, Mari Gilbert remained a steadfast figure, her advocacy reaching people across the country who were touched by her story. She reminded everyone that Shannon's life had been more than the tragic events of her final night. Mari's efforts created a legacy, pushing for changes that would improve the future for countless others in similar circumstances. Her work with lawmakers and her determination to keep Shannon's story alive served as a powerful reminder of the impact one person's dedication could have, even in the face of overwhelming odds. In the years that followed, the coastlines of Long Island remained largely unchanged, the marshes and dunes continuing to guard the secrets they held. For the families of the victims, life had moved forward, though the scars of their losses remained. The search for the Long Island serial killer had left its mark on the region, creating a lasting sense of unease among those who knew the story. Yet, for all of the setbacks and unanswered questions, the case was never forgotten. The collective memory of the victims, amplified by their families' resilience and the tireless search for truth, continued to inspire others. As Mari had often said, justice was not a single act, but a journey, a commitment to remembering those who were lost and honoring them with the truth. And so, with the coast a silent witness, the mystery of the Long Island serial killer endures, a reminder of both the darkness that exists in the world and the courage of those who refuse to let it prevail. The next story is called A Graveyard of Mystery. The evening was cloaked in silence, with only the faint hum of crickets and the whisper of distant wind moving through the tall grass. This area, a sprawling expanse of marsh and scrubland along Interstate 45 in Texas, had become a place locals avoided after dark. To those who knew it well, the land held an unspoken history, like something out of a nightmare, a place where shadows seemed deeper and where people whispered stories of the unsolved mysteries hidden in the thick reeds. In the early 1990s, the Texas killing fields became the eerie backdrop for one of the most baffling and haunting cases in Texas. It was here, amid the isolation and quiet, that an unidentified body was discovered, and with it, a series of questions that would haunt investigators and families for years to come. The body lay hidden in the dense foliage, concealed by the reeds and grass that stretched along the interstate. Even to the seasoned officers who arrived on the scene, the sight of it was chilling. The years of exposure to the elements had left the remains almost a part of the landscape itself, a ghostly figure in the marsh. When word of the discovery broke, a wave of dread spread through the town. Investigators from nearby Houston, along with state police, arrived at the scene, realizing this might be more than a solitary tragedy. The law enforcement team, led by Detective Jim Harris, began their work, combing through the evidence with measured determination. Harris, a man in his late 40s with graying hair and a deep resolve, had seen many cases over his career, but this one felt different. There was something ominous about the field, something that suggested it was hiding more than just one secret. As the investigation continued, more remains began to surface, each discovery adding a layer of darkness to the case. Forensics teams meticulously examined the area, gathering samples and documenting every detail, but the Texas killing fields held onto its secrets tightly. With each new finding, the question became not just who had done this, but why these individuals had been left in this barren, lonely place. The lack of clear evidence and the passage of time added to the weight of the investigation, creating an almost unbearable silence around the case. There were no obvious signs pointing to the perpetrator, only a growing pattern of horror that suggested a methodical mind at work. Despite the lack of leads, Detective Harris and his team pressed on, knowing that these victims deserved answers. They scoured records, interviewed anyone who might have crossed paths with these individuals, and spent countless hours trying to reconstruct the lives that had been so violently taken. Over time, they began to suspect that the perpetrator had intentionally chosen this isolated stretch of land to cover their tracks, making it a final resting place that seemed as if it could swallow secrets whole. Detective Harris stood in the thick, humid air of the marshland, his eyes scanning the area where the latest remains had been found. This was now the third discovery in the same field, and the team's unease had deepened with each case. No longer was this just a tragic find. It had become clear that a troubling pattern was emerging. Each new case seemed to connect to the last, drawing a chilling line across the Texas landscape, one that demanded answers they still struggled to find. The team pressed deeper into their investigation, analyzing every detail with the precision of seasoned professionals. Yet, despite the hours of interviews and the grueling review of records, clues remained scarce. They were dealing with someone calculated, someone who left almost no trace behind. The person responsible seemed to know these fields well, perhaps even anticipated the response of the authorities. The very land itself seemed to work against them, swallowing up clues, blurring timelines, and erasing potential witnesses with an eerie silence that settled over the fields as soon as night fell. Detective Harris leaned heavily on the forensic team, hoping they could offer some new insight, something that would give life to the case. But the answers were slow to come. The victims' identities, slowly pieced together, only painted part of the picture. Each one was someone who had drifted, unnoticed, into the field, a life that had crossed paths with an unknown darkness. Forensics could only tell so much, but Harris pushed forward, questioning what these people had in common beyond the brutal end they had found. Who were they, and why had they been drawn to this lonely place? The detectives spent days revisiting the sites, cataloging each clue, and each grim discovery was added to a growing map on the wall of the investigation room. The pattern seemed almost deliberate, yet still incomprehensible. As Harris pored over each piece of the case, he realized he wasn't simply tracking one person's twisted intentions. He was facing a landscape where multiple, disconnected horrors had played out. It was a field tainted by more than one story, a place that now held the secrets of both its natural life and its dark history. The field's secrets began to unearth a deeper tension within the team. Each investigator wrestled with their own thoughts, struggling to maintain the balance between empathy for the victims and the relentless pursuit of a resolution. As the investigation dragged on, Detective Harris could sense the weight growing heavier on the entire team. Leads were scarce, yet the urgency to solve these cases had only intensified. Each day seemed to reveal just enough to drive them deeper into the mystery, but not enough to break it open. It felt as though they were walking in circles, tracing a path that only led them back to the same troubling questions. Frustration loomed as days turned to weeks, and each dead end left a quiet mark on the team's spirits. They needed a breakthrough, something to shatter the veil that covered the truth buried in those fields. Harris directed his attention to those on the fringes of society, individuals who, like the victims, often moved unnoticed through life. He wondered if there might be someone who had crossed paths with the victims, who might have seen something in the dark without knowing its full meaning. These were difficult conversations, ones that took him to places where people kept to themselves, guarded and wary. He met those who lived at the edges of town, people who frequented places that others avoided, asking questions in whispers and quiet conversations. For some, the Texas killing fields were a place better left unspoken, a shadow that drifted through town but never stayed long enough to be fully understood. Then came a call. A truck driver passing through had stopped along the interstate near the fields late one evening and had seen someone leaving the area in the early morning hours. Harris's pulse quickened as he listened, the pieces slowly aligning in his mind. The witness described a vehicle, worn and faded, its driver barely visible in the dim light. Though vague, it was a glimpse into the elusive figure they had been pursuing. It was something new, a fragile lead that offered just a sliver of hope. Harris and his team immediately began their search, tracking the movements of vehicles that matched the description and questioning anyone who might have seen something similar. They knew that time was against them, that every moment stretched the distance between them and the person responsible. Yet, the investigation team continued on, committed to finding the path that would lead them out of the darkness and bring justice to those whose voices had been silenced in the stillness of the Texas killing fields. Detective Harris and his team now had a sliver of hope, a single lead that glimmered in the darkness. They began to narrow their focus, tracing every detail of the truck driver's account, hoping to find something concrete. Each piece of information was examined from every angle, but the truth remained elusive. Yet, Harris' resolve was unshaken. He understood the weight of what they were seeking, the closure that these victims' families needed, and the justice that had waited far too long. As the team expanded their search, Harris reached out to other departments across Texas and neighboring states, hoping that a similar case or an overlooked pattern might emerge. Calls and messages filled his days and nights, bringing scattered reports and local stories of disappearances and isolated crimes, each one carrying the potential to connect with the mystery at hand. Harris spent hours going over each account, looking for any trace of familiarity, a feeling of recognition that might tie them together. But for all his efforts, they remained separate, isolated by miles and circumstances that seemed unrelated to the field in Texas. One late evening, as Harris pored over records in the dim light of his office, a new thought began to take shape. What if this person had been moving for years, drifting from place to place, never staying long enough to leave a strong trace? The unsettling thought gnawed at him, suggesting a figure who understood how to avoid detection, someone who knew the dark spaces where people disappear. This theory carried a chilling implication, one that implied the field wasn't just a coincidence, but had been chosen for a purpose. It was an ideal setting, isolated, overlooked, and disconnected from the world beyond. With renewed purpose, the team began to look into missing persons, cases from years past, widening the search to encompass those who had seemingly vanished without a trace. Harris hoped that somewhere in those records, a detail would stand out, something that had been overlooked and might bring clarity to this intricate, haunted case. As he read through files, he was reminded again of the lives they were fighting for, the individuals whose paths had ended in that desolate field, whose stories he was now responsible for uncovering. Detective Harris was driven by a singular focus, his mind consumed with the faces of those who had disappeared, each one a life that had ended too soon and too silently. The field had become an anchor for him, a symbol of all the unanswered questions and the sense of unfinished work that hung heavy over him and his team. The search expanded across the state, touching cities and towns where similar disappearances had occurred, each one hauntingly familiar, yet frustratingly separate. Late one evening, a call came in. It was a tip from another department, a case that bore a disturbing resemblance to the Texas field. A witness had come forward with information, claiming they had seen a figure who matched the description given by the truck driver. It was a vague but promising connection, and Harris seized it. They began piecing together the person's movements, matching travel routes and timelines that suggested a nomadic existence, moving from one town to the next with no apparent ties. The intensity of the investigation reached new heights. Each day brought fresh insight, new leads, and dead ends alike, but they continued pressing forward, determined to bring a resolution to the families and the community. Harris knew they were close, that with every step they were inching toward an answer that had eluded them for years. The lines on his face deepened with each passing day, but his spirit was unwavering. Finally, after days of surveillance and meticulous preparation, the team closed in. The suspect was apprehended, and with them, a history of haunting acts that stretched farther than Harris could have imagined. The case that had seemed so impenetrable began to unfold, each piece fitting together, revealing a story that had lurked in the shadows of the Texas killing fields for years. The next and final story is called A Trail of Fear. It was a blistering summer day in 1988 when a grim discovery would forever alter the quiet fishing town of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Nestled between Boston and Cape Cod, New Bedford was known for its historic whaling industry and close-knit neighborhoods, a place where families had lived for generations, trusting their routines and each other. But on a nondescript stretch of Route 140, that peace was shattered. A state trooper, patrolling the deserted roadside, stumbled upon a scene he wouldn't soon forget. In the brush, barely visible from the road, lay a woman's body. She had been left there, hidden from view, but not entirely concealed, as if someone wanted her to be discovered eventually. The sight was chilling, and though the officer's mind raced with possibilities, he couldn't yet know this was only the beginning. As more officers and investigators arrived, the site became a scene of quiet tension and dread. They noted every detail, the position of the body, the nearby brush that had been trampled as though in a struggle, and the silent clues left behind. This discovery was disturbing enough, but soon the case would take an even darker turn. Within weeks, another woman's body appeared, dumped in a similar fashion along the same lonely stretch of highway. These weren't random accidents or isolated tragedies. The similarities between the victims' appearances, the locations, and the manner in which they were left suggested something far more sinister. As the discovery of bodies continued, it quickly became clear to law enforcement that they were dealing with a pattern, a possible serial predator targeting vulnerable women in and around New Bedford. At first, the identities of these women were a mystery, but as they were gradually pieced together, a disturbing commonality emerged. Many of the women had connections to the city's troubled areas, parts of New Bedford that had been plagued by crime, addiction, and poverty. These were neighborhoods where people sometimes disappeared without a trace, their stories lost amid the struggles of daily life. But these women's stories would not go unnoticed. Each victim had friends, family members, and others who knew them, who cared for them, and who desperately sought answers as the number of missing persons grew. News spread quickly through the city and beyond, stirring fear and unease. The local papers started covering the discoveries with alarming headlines, and residents became wary of traveling alone or leaving their loved ones unaccounted for. The bustling streets and community gatherings took on a different tone, with whispers about who might be next, and questions of how long it would be before the killer struck again. Authorities scrambled to piece together clues, but the investigation proved difficult from the start. These were women who lived at the fringes of society, and their lives, though precious, were complicated. Many had struggled with personal hardships, and some had experienced periods of being disconnected from their families. This made tracking their last known whereabouts challenging, leaving gaps in the timeline that investigators struggled to fill. It was a case full of dead ends, and each one left the investigators feeling as if they were chasing shadows. As the number of bodies continued to rise, it became clear that a single person, perhaps even someone familiar with the area, was using the highways as their hunting ground. For the families of the victims, the days grew heavy with a terrible waiting, the kind of waiting that gnaws at the spirit as they held onto hope while fearing the worst. As days turned to weeks, the police noticed a deeply unsettling pattern emerging. Every few weeks, another woman would vanish, and soon afterward, a lifeless body would be found abandoned along the quiet stretches of Route 140. Each scene was eerily similar, as if the person responsible was taunting law enforcement, leaving these grim clues just out of reach. The detectives on the case grew increasingly uneasy. They began to recognize the distinct method with which the killer operated, a careful consistency that made the crimes all the more terrifying. The women were all of similar age, each dealing with personal struggles and caught in circumstances that had made them vulnerable. Yet, the killer's precision was meticulous. He left little physical evidence, no obvious trails to follow. Investigators were dealing with a ghost, someone who seemed to know exactly when and where to strike without leaving a trace. The gravity of the case began to weigh heavily on the local law enforcement. They knew time was against them. Every delay was another chance for the killer to disappear into the shadows and strike again. In response, the police established a task force, enlisting experienced detectives and forensic experts. Together, they pored over every detail they could find, each autopsy report, each witness statement, each piece of evidence gathered at the scenes. They began mapping out possible connections, comparing crime scenes, hoping for even a small breakthrough. The public was gripped with a sense of anxiety that was hard to shake. In New Bedford, families kept their loved ones close, and those with daughters, sisters, or friends who might fit the pattern felt a new sense of vigilance. Women in the area, especially those who frequented certain parts of town, began altering their routines, wary of who might be watching. For a town unaccustomed to such violence, the fear was palpable. Conversations in coffee shops, on street corners, and in the aisles of grocery stores centered on the unfolding horror. Everyone had a theory, a suspicion, a hint of dread as to who might be behind the monstrous acts, and nobody wanted to imagine it could be someone within their own community. Meanwhile, as investigators probed deeper, more unsettling details surfaced. They noticed that nearly all the victims had been last seen in the same general area of New Bedford. This part of town, struggling with a rise in criminal activity and addiction, was often overlooked by outsiders. It was a place where the lives of some were marked by hardship, where a stranger might come and go without attracting much notice. And yet, for the women who disappeared, this was home, a place they knew well, but that had somehow turned into a trap. As detectives expanded their inquiries, they began questioning the people closest to the victims. Friends, family members, and acquaintances were interviewed, but the stories they provided only deepened the mystery. Most victims had been seen on busy streets, public places where it seemed impossible for a predator to operate undetected. And yet, one by one, these women had vanished as if swallowed by the city itself. The police took note of anyone in the community who had connections to multiple victims, creating a list of possible persons of interest. They hoped to find patterns in the movements of these individuals, a thread that might finally unravel the mystery. One person who soon drew the investigators' attention was a local man known to spend time near the areas where the women had been last seen. He was known for his unpredictable behavior and his presence on the fringes of the same social circles frequented by the victims. He often loitered, seemingly without purpose, and several witnesses recalled seeing him close to the victims shortly before their disappearances. But, despite the circumstantial evidence, he denied any involvement when questioned. He cooperated just enough to avoid further suspicion, slipping through the fingers of law enforcement every time they got close. With leads like this proving inconclusive, the pressure mounted. Detectives faced scrutiny from the public and the media, both pressing for answers. Many questioned why the police couldn't bring the person responsible to justice, but those close to the investigation understood the immense difficulty of capturing someone who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. With each passing week, the task force's pressure intensified. Investigators had identified a handful of individuals as persons of interest, each with some connection to the victims or their community. But nothing substantial enough had emerged to make a solid case, and every lead seemed to dissipate under closer scrutiny. A collective sense of frustration began to settle over the team, the weight of unsolved cases dragging morale down. One person under suspicion was a local mechanic, known for his connections to parts of town frequented by the victims. While his name had surfaced during questioning, he was elusive, deflecting inquiries with a calm detachment that left the detectives uneasy. He claimed to have seen several of the missing women, but always in passing, always with an alibi or some hazy recollection that made confirming his statements nearly impossible. His movements, like the victims, weaved through New Bedford's network of side streets and darkened alleyways, places where privacy was scarce and routine encounters easily went unnoticed. As the investigation wore on, some detectives began to suspect that the killer might be familiar with police procedures, someone who knew enough to evade their every step. The possibility that this could be someone within their own circles, a person with knowledge of law enforcement methods, or who worked nearby, cast a shadow over the team. The idea lingered, unspoken but present, as they meticulously combed through the evidence and re-examined past statements. Meanwhile, the victims' families continued to press for answers. Parents, siblings, and friends, people whose lives had been turned upside down, grew increasingly vocal, urging the police to bring an end to the nightmare. They held vigils and community meetings, refusing to let the memory of their loved ones fade into cold case files. In this, they drew the attention of the media, who began to amplify their pleas, pushing the case into the national spotlight. News outlets sent reporters to New Bedford, each one eager to tell the tragic story of a town caught in the grip of terror. The community's frustration mirrored the desperation felt within the task force, heightening the urgency to bring the killer to justice. Under this mounting pressure, the police started implementing new strategies. They introduced patrols in key areas, enlisted criminal profilers, and even began re-interviewing those previously questioned, hoping to catch a slip-up or a change in someone's story. They deployed plainclothes officers to shadow potential suspects and enlisted the help of state police, casting a wider net in the hopes of finally catching their elusive target. Despite the enhanced efforts, the case continued to defy easy answers. Suspects who seemed likely at first soon appeared less plausible under close examination. Key details that had seemed to fit the puzzle turned out to be coincidences, red herrings that led the detectives on a series of false trails. It became increasingly clear that the person they were hunting had either meticulously planned every step or was terrifyingly skilled at adapting and improvising on the spot. As the investigation struggled to gain traction, the weight of the unsolved case fell heavily on New Bedford's community. An atmosphere of suspicion blanketed the town, transforming daily routines into sources of dread. Parents instructed their daughters to travel in groups, never alone, and every stranger passing through seemed like a potential threat. Trust, once a staple of the small-town life in New Bedford, was now rare. At local coffee shops, people whispered theories, discussing anyone who seemed out of place or who'd recently shown any sign of peculiar behavior. The community was on edge, and that tension weighed especially on the families of those still missing, who couldn't yet claim the closure, however difficult, that the others had. Mothers and fathers lived with an ever-present worry, clinging to hope while confronting an endless stream of questions that kept them awake at night. Sisters, brothers, and friends stayed vigilant, taking up the search on their own when they felt that official efforts had stalled. The local press ran stories on the investigation's developments, or lack thereof, keeping the case in the public eye. But over time, a kind of helplessness took hold. People began to realize that if the police, with all their resources, couldn't solve the case, the killer might never be found. Frustration and fear intertwined as a tragic sort of resignation started to settle in, a quiet acknowledgement that the terror stalking their town might go unpunished. Yet even as some grew resigned, others were determined to keep fighting for justice. The families of the victims continued to hold vigils, lighting candles and telling stories to keep their loved ones' memories alive. They gathered in church halls, community centers, and parks, places that had once brought people together for celebrations and now served as spaces of collective grief and support. At these gatherings, friends and neighbors embraced, vowing to remember those they had lost. For them, giving up wasn't an option. To give up would be to let the killer slip away unnoticed, unremembered, and that was something they couldn't bear. In the midst of this, local authorities kept searching for ways to keep the case from going cold. Why act otherwise? They turned to new technologies, hoping that advancements in forensic science could reveal clues missed in the initial investigations. They enlisted outside experts, professionals known for their work on similar cases, and asked for any advice that might turn the tide. Specialists in profiling, psychology, and even geographic mapping were consulted, each bringing a fresh perspective. But as days turned to months, These efforts brought little progress, and the town's hope dimmed further. Years passed, and for many in New Bedford, the fear that once defined the town began to blend into the background. Life, in its familiar way, continued on. But for those who had lost family members, there was no moving on. Only a quiet endurance, a hope that justice would one day be served. In the early 1990s, new leadership within local law enforcement reignited the drive to solve the case. This new team was determined to bring fresh eyes to every aspect of the investigation. They pored over the original case files, re-examining each piece of evidence and re-interviewing past suspects and witnesses. Advances in forensic technology, once out of reach, were now accessible, and the team hoped these tools might bring clarity to the fragments of evidence left behind. Their persistence led to a breakthrough. DNA technology, now far more advanced than it had been when the bodies were first discovered, allowed forensic specialists to retest samples from the crime scenes. They ran these samples through updated databases, hoping to identify the elusive individual responsible for the horrors that had haunted New Bedford. With this renewed effort, the investigators uncovered a partial match, enough to identify someone who had previously escaped suspicion. Armed with this new lead, the task force resumed their interviews, carefully piecing together details that had once been overlooked. Witnesses who had long since moved on were tracked down, and suspects were brought in for questioning. The atmosphere was different this time. The team was close, and everyone felt it. Finally, in a twist that stunned the town, law enforcement uncovered connections to a man who had lived and worked in the New Bedford area during the time of the disappearances. He was someone familiar with the same areas the victims had frequented, a person with a past that was marked by behavior that, in hindsight, painted a disturbing picture. He was brought in for questioning, and after hours of careful interrogation, the details began to unravel. Through the accounts of witnesses and forensic evidence, the pieces of the puzzle came together. With enough evidence to make an arrest, law enforcement announced that the case had reached a turning point. News of the development spread rapidly, and the town that had once been paralyzed by fear now held its breath, waiting for the full truth to emerge. For the families, there was a sense of closure, a solemn relief that justice had finally caught up to the person who had taken so much from them. In court, they watched as the man who had once hidden in plain sight was held accountable. And while nothing could bring back the loved ones they had lost, they found a measure of peace in knowing that his days of terrorizing their town had come to an end. As the trial concluded and the town reflected on the events that had shaped New Bedford for so many years, the community began a process of healing. It was a slow journey, marked by remembrance and resilience as the people of New Bedford moved forward, determined to honor the memories of those who had been taken from them. The town would never forget the painful chapter it had endured, but together, they looked to a future no longer haunted by the shadow of an unknown danger. If today's stories left you haunted by unanswered questions and searching for justice, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the strange, dark, and mysterious. Make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. We post daily. We'd love to hear your thoughts or theories about these cases in the comments below. Wow. Could a new clue or perspective finally unravel these chilling mysteries? Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we never see. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next story.